Great, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sophia. I manage and organize Spectrum events for you, bringing the community together through learning at Spectrum. So for those of you who are new to Spectrum, aside from organizing webinars, which touch on current affairs like these, and also forward-looking ones, we run physical events at our beautiful space at Duo Tower. We offer workspaces for the community experience, and we bring together members, providing the connections to expand your business. So today's breakfast webinar is on the evolution of Agri-Food Tech and impacting with impact. We are very privileged to have John Friedman, Director at AgFunder Asia and Grow Agri-Food Tech Accelerator. John is also the founding director of Makana Ventures, a Singapore-based collective with activities aimed at driving a more sustainable agri-food system across Southeast Asia. So AgFunder is one of the world's most active agri-food tech investors. It is founded in 2013 with offices in Silicon Valley and Singapore. Their mission is to invest in impact-driven technologies to rapidly transform the global food and agriculture system. So participants, if you have any questions, please post them on the Q&A window here. So John and I will address the questions after John's presentation. So without further ado, John, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Sophia, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this, for once it's not raining, Thursday morning. I'm not sure where you're dialing in from in Singapore, but at least here in the sort of central area, it's pretty clear. Yeah, thank you very much for the warm introduction, Sophia, and obviously for Spectrum for having me here today. After such a comprehensive introduction, I don't think there's much left for me to say in order to provide a background about myself, but I think you know, what I hope to achieve through this morning's discussion is to provide a little bit of background on the evolution of the agri-food tech sector, the role and activities which AgFunder plays in that, what we can look forward to here in Singapore and Southeast Asia over the next few years, and obviously the sort of importance, the increasing importance of, I guess, the agri-food space and both investing in it and just generally being aware of what's going on. And then, you know, perhaps a little bit about myself and my own journey into agri-food tech. But just to kick off, let me just also add, I would, you know, ideally if this was a physical presentation in person, I would love for it to be as interactive as possible. Obviously we have some limitations today, but, you know, by all means, I encourage you, please share your questions on the chat panel, and I look forward to being able to respond to those after the sort of presentation part. So without further ado, let me just share my screen, bear with me. Okay. Sophia, can I just confirm that you can see that all right?
Fantastic, John.
Good stuff. All right, let's kick off. So we're here to sort of talk about the evolution of agri-food tech and the idea that you can invest with impact. Where to start? Look, I think it's been a momentous several years, obviously, in the sector, but just sort of bringing it closer to home, obviously a pretty significant past couple of months for everyone around the world in terms of dealing with COVID and the realities that that's brought upon us as a society. I think, you know, in my own perspective, one of the silver linings of this whole experience, besides getting to spend a lot of quality time at home with the family, obviously, one of the silver linings for me has been this sort of tide shift in awareness and conversation taking place about our food system, which in my mind didn't really exist up until very recently. And obviously you know, this has been driven by our immediate experiences as individuals, as consumers. I will move to this slide. I think, you know, a number of these headlines would not be familiar. Obviously the picture in the upper right corner of empty supermarket shelves. I'm sure a number of you listening today, as well as myself, would have experienced that firsthand, and the realities which COVID brought upon us in terms of supply chain disruption as lockdowns went in place, movement control orders in Malaysia, challenging our own import-reliant nation, putting it to the test, essentially. If you recall back, there was that sort of 24-hour period in mid-March when Malaysia announced its MCO, and it was just crazy. Bubble tea shops running dry. My wife was in one of those lines. But I think just to bring it back to a more serious point, the experience through COVID, again, has shone a light on the fragilities of our food system, which, again, personally, I don't feel many people were considering or even aware of for many, many years. We had very recently the case of a local distributor having to dump 250,000 eggs because during the lockdown period, obviously we were trying to meet demand or projected demand for food substances, and obviously local importers and distributors ended up over importing certain stocks. And just recently, one of those distributors had to throw away 250,000 eggs because they had gone spoiled. But across the pond, we have similar stories on the headlines around the world, US, Europe, even emerging markets. The significant impact which disrupted supply chains can result on our food system, where we've got literally millions of animals being euthanized in the US because slaughterhouses have been shut down because of fear of contamination and spread of the disease, and that resulted in just a capacity constraint across the food system. And at the same time, every day you have dozens of millions of people around the world still going hungry. So it's experiences like this, be it supply chain, be it health and safety of our food system, which is forcing the conversation to happen. And obviously, I think a large part of the inspiration behind this month's Spectrum series on food. So from my perspective, I'm glad that we're having this conversation. If we take a step back and just sort of consider the importance of the agri-food industry, I think it's worth considering the enormity of it. We're talking about an $8 trillion industry, which employs approximately 40% of the global population, and obviously is the one industry which every single one of us on the planet relies on for our daily meals, essentially. Be it from the production side to the distribution and the food packaging and innovation, and ultimately the consumption. Just reflecting on my own journey and my own eye-opening or experience in coming into the space, these two charts or tables really sort of hit me when I first came across them several years ago. The one on the left is a table which was published in 2015 by consultancy McKinsey, which was analyzing the digitization and level of innovation, if you want to think about it that way, across all different major industries. And back in 2015, as you can see, agriculture ranks right down at the very bottom in terms of level of innovation and digitization that had taken place within the industry. And then you obviously sort of compare that to the chart on the right, and this will sort of bring me to my point around the investment aspect of what we do at AgFunder. But if you consider this chart put together by the United Nations and Deloitte, it's comparing the amount of capital being invested in agri-food tech compared to some of the other more popular venture spaces or tech industries. In this case, obviously, it's comparing it to fintech, which obviously has been a very important and exciting space, not least so for Singapore, obviously, with our strong financial industry. But as you can see, the level of investment dollar compared to most of these other industries is just insignificant, practically. By 2015, the total investment dollar going into ag tech and food tech was approximately 3% of the total venture industry. When you consider, the enormity of the challenges, the enormity of the opportunities, I guess, which we face every day in our dealing with the food system. So that was the sort of building blocks for my own, I guess, progress or journey into the space, sort of thinking about these challenges, thinking about the opportunities. Allow me to spend a bit of time just to introduce AgFunder, who we are and what we do. So here's part of the team. AgFunder was founded back in 2013, as Sophia mentioned, in Silicon Valley, on the belief that innovation and targeted investment, particularly at the early stage, would be our most powerful tools to effect a rapid and sustainable change across the global food system. So again, recognizing the need for innovation, as the McKinsey report clearly shows, as well as the absolute lack of venture investment going into this space. So I'll sort of direct your attention to the two gentlemen on the top left, Michael Dean and Rob Leclerc. These guys are the founding partners of AgFunder, and prior to setting up a venture capital firm, these guys were running a sustainable sunflower plantation in West Africa, believe it or not. Rob has a PhD from Yale in crop bioscience, and Michael comes from the corporate space as a lawyer turned in asset manager investor. And the two of them, very mission-driven individuals, had identified, I guess, the opportunity to set up an operation growing sunflower plants and pressing the oil and distributing it into the West African market as a healthier and more sustainable alternative to oil palm, which was dominating the market. This was in the early 2010s. Fast forward, after a few years of steady growth, unfortunately, because of geopolitical risks, there was a coup in Mali that happened, which essentially dried up any capital investment and forced the team to shut down their operations and pretty much get out of West Africa. Otherwise, the army would be rolling in. So Michael and Rob moved back to the States, where they both had a base, and took a bit of time, I guess, to reflect on their experience in running the operation in Africa, as well as the general awareness, the lack of capital, the lack of voice, I guess, that was sharing what the exciting innovations that were taking place in the world of Agri-Food Tech. And so hence AgFunder was born initially as a platform, digitally native platform, so certainly leveraging all the benefits of modern day technology and scalability. So they created AgFunder as a community to engage the industry players, be it from large ag to the entrepreneurs, as well as the investor base across primarily the North American market at this time, and to essentially lend their voice towards the challenges and opportunities in the food and agriculture system. As they saw it, this was the white space. There wasn't enough people talking about it. There wasn't enough money going into it. So they essentially filled that gap. And through our media platform over the years, AgFunderNews, we've established ourselves as essentially the industry site of record and go-to knowledge base with over 2 million yearly site visits, obviously 260,000 page visits a month. The statistics here you can read, and I believe sort of speak for themselves. To this day, if you haven't already checked out AgFunderNews and have any amount of interest in what's going on in this space, I highly recommend it. I myself was a subscriber to the weekly newsletter for at least 2 years before ending up joining the company. It's a fantastic resource for anything and everything going on in this space. And essentially, this is what we do. We've established ourselves as a product specialist in the agri-food tech space. In our relatively short existence of 7 to 8 years, we've established ourselves as one of the most prolific investors in the sector, with 40 investments across 4 portfolios, I should say 4 funds. It's just, this slide shows, I guess, some of our proprietary advantages, or the secret sauce, as we would refer to it in the VC space, around our network connections, the deal flow that we're able to achieve by virtue of the fact that we position ourselves in the middle of the industry as this sort of node for information, the relationships that we build with both sort of corporate partners as well as the emerging innovators and entrepreneurs as they progress through their journey, and we help to give them a voice through our platform of AgFunderNews. So that's AgFunder in a nutshell. I think many of you on the call would be interested in just sort of hearing about the evolution of Agri-Food Tech as an investment sector. Obviously, that's what the title promised. So I will try to deliver a little bit about that right now. The Agri-Food Tech evolution, if you just think back to the slide that I showed, the Deloitte chart, which referenced the gradual but still modest increase of Agri-Food Tech investment between the years 2010 to 2015. So if you recall, in 2010, the amount of investment dollar going into agri-food as a sector was less than 1% of the total venture industry. By 2015, that had barely increased to basically 3%. I'm happy to report that the needle is moving in the right direction. This chart shows the increase in investment over the last several years into the agri-food tech sector. And this is the data or the information provided here, and in many more of our research reports, is something which I'm very proud of. Again, AgFunder is not just about being an investment firm, silent and stealthy in our sort of investment decisions and just constructing a portfolio for pure commercial gain. Absolutely not. I think what we are trying to do here is educate the market and bring more awareness and increased attention and excitement around what's going on in the agri-food tech sector. And so a core part of that, in addition to the AgFunderNews platform, or the AgFunderNews website, I should say, are these industry research reports, which we publish throughout the year. This chart is taken from our sort of flagship yearly year in review report, which overviews the previous year's, all the deals and investments that have gone into the sector from the previous year, and really digs down into the granularity of looking at individual deals, geographies, what stage and category these investments take place in. So you can consider it almost like the the encyclopedia or of sort of agri-food tech investment year on year. So anyhow, this chart obviously paints a pretty picture in my mind about the gradual increase in investment capital going into the space. Despite the fact that we had approximately 5% reduction between 2019 compared to 2018 sort of bumper investment, actually that reflects quite positively when you put it into comparison of the broader VC industry receiving approximately 16% reduced investment according to PitchBook data in the year 2019 compared to the year before. So, down 16% versus down 5%, agri-food tech has come out relatively strong. And, I think along the same lines, there's been a lot of conversation recently around, the state of investments and venture capital, especially given the, increasing volatility and economic impact of COVID. Again, happy to report, without having the data available to share with you, the enthusiasm and the participation in the agri-food tech space over recent months I think it's fair to say it's second only to medtech for obvious reasons. But the amount of deal flow, the amount of engagement from investors only continues to rise, and I'll touch more upon that later on in this presentation. But obviously here, as you can see, we've achieved approximately 250% increase in investment dollar over the past 5 years, which is obviously a really exciting fact, a positive realization considering the enormity of the need for capital and investment and transformation in this sector. So just to, I guess, drill a little bit deeper into some of the findings that the report provides to readers, and as a quick aside, I'd be happy to share all of these reports with anyone who's interested afterwards. Just email me. I'll include my email address at the end of this presentation, or you can simply go online to the website and navigate through to our research page. But going back to the topic, the reports, as I said, really add a lot of in-depth analysis into the various subsectors of the agri-food tech space. And if you, I guess, consider if you're a relative newcomer to the sector, you might be aware of, obviously, alternative proteins has been a very hot topic recently. But when you think of agri-food tech here in Singapore, it's probably either impossible foods or urban vertical farming, or perhaps aquaculture, right? The fact of the matter is, we're talking about the entire value chain of food production. So everything from right as far upstream on the farm, precision agriculture, seed genetics, crop bioscience, etc., making your way down to sort of midstream technologies and midstream solutions, supply chain, obviously sort of post-harvest technology, distribution. There's been a lot of interest, obviously, in sort of digitized supply chain traceability, obviously, and food safety in that sort of midstream area. And then obviously, we progress downstream, closer to the consumer when we're talking about, e-commerce delivery, novel product creation, formulation, ingredients, etc. So, we really try to capture the investment flavor and trends across the entire value chain of agri-food tech. And it gives us an advantage as both the researcher as well as the investor of analyzing these trends and seeing where the investment interests are ebbing and flowing year in, year out. So I think that was something which really attracted me personally to the work that AgFunder was doing. I'd like to just make the example of the innovative food category here, which you can see is the 5% orange segment. A great many people who I've spoken to over the past year, when I talk to them about what I'm doing, hey John, long time no see, what are you up to? Oh, I'm doing sort of agri-food tech these days. Oh wow, tell me about what's the next sort of Beyond Meat IPO. So clearly there's been a lot of focus on the innovative food and especially the sort of alternative protein space, which is a sort of component of innovative foods. Thanks a lot to the likes of Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, obviously coming to market across Southeast Asia last year. I remember all the fanfare when Impossible launched in Singapore last March. We had all those special tie-ups with restaurants across town, and the takeover of Lau Pa Sat, which I thought was especially well done. Just to give a bit of context, the alternative protein or the innovative food category saw a 2x increase in investment dollar from 2018 to 2019, reflective of this wave of sort of momentum and euphoria around the alternative protein space, and overall represents a 17% increase in the number of deals that we saw taking place in this one particular sector. Excuse me. So I think again, the question has been, well, what's happening now in COVID? But again, to building on what I said earlier, these trends look really set to continue. For example, Impossible Foods recently closed a $500 million Series F round just back in March, which brings their total fundraising to approximately $1.3 billion to date. And obviously we've got some national interest tied to that, with Temasek leading the last several rounds. Even GIC participating in another recent Agri-Tech play in a sort of crop bioscience company called Appeal, which perhaps many of you wouldn't be as familiar with as, say, Impossible. But what this company is doing is essentially applying a protective film layer over fruits and vegetables to increase shelf life and prevent spoilage. So here we have two of our largest national investors leading the charge in agri-food tech on a global scale. So from the Singapore context, really exciting times. And I think just remaining a little bit, remaining for a while longer on the alternative protein space, just because it's such a interesting and hot topic. It's not all about plant-based meats. There's this strong emergence of the cell-based sector of alternative proteins, which is gaining traction and investment dollars. Singapore's own bio-food tech startup Turtle Tree Labs, which some of you may have heard of, or we may even have Feng Ru or Max joining us today. They're developing human breast milk in the lab. They recently closed their seed round, which counted the likes of Saudi Arabia's KBW Ventures and Silicon Valley investment fund K2 Global on its cap table. So really fantastic achievement from the guys at Turtle Tree Labs, shining a spotlight on Singapore. They're not the only ones. Another local champion in the cell-based space, Shock Meats, one of the pioneers certainly in Southeast Asia, and arguably the first clean meat company here in Singapore and Southeast Asia, and the first ones globally to be focusing on crustaceans. They're in the process of their own Series A fundraising. So, achieving new milestones in the space and in this geography for the agri-food tech industry as a whole. So there's a lot to be excited about, generally, as an industry, as well as, the role that Singapore and Singaporean companies have to play in this space. On that note, allow me to perhaps, navigate the conversation back to the opportunity at our doorstep, and I guess what brought AgFunder to Asia. But before we get there, perhaps just a little bit about myself. I was born in Hawaii, so another little island in the Pacific, not too dissimilar from Singapore. We've got our beaches and we've got our high rises. We have a few more mountains, so that's one thing that I miss. Bukit Timah only does so much when you're looking for a bit of elevation. But yeah, growing up in Hawaii and spent a number of years in the UK for my schooling before moving back to the US for my university. I moved to Singapore I moved to Singapore in 2007 to take up a job in the investment banking industry, where I spent most of my professional career, essentially the past 12 years, between Deutsche Bank and Morgan Stanley on the public market side. And perhaps you're asking, well, how does an investment banker find his way to agri-food tech? And I guess that's exactly the question that I was trying to figure out for myself. I think it's fair to say that whilst my time in investment banking was incredibly sort of enriching and rewarding from an education perspective. It really taught me to appreciate sort of market economics and look at the world from a macro view and start to question and consider some of these sort of high level projections and forecasts that we as a society and a population would be dealing with. Ultimately, what motivated me to jump ship, as it were, was I guess the tangibility of my involvement with companies like Shock Meats and Turtle Tree Labs, and a number of the other, obviously, emerging startups that are growing both here locally as well as overseas. So I think, if I just reflect back on my journey from university in New York, making the decision to come out to Singapore, it was really on the belief that I could be part of this, the Asian century and the promise of, building my life in this part of the world. I should probably add, my mother actually grew up in Johor Bahru, so I've got strong family ties to Southeast Asia, family and cousins across Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So it wasn't absolutely sort of foreign or bizarre for me to be considering a move out to Asia. But I think one thing which became, I guess, more of a sort of a nagging reminder to myself during my years in the bank was, the idea that I could be perhaps more involved on the ground and ingrained in the excitement of some of these emerging businesses and innovative areas. And unfortunately, I just felt like I wasn't necessarily achieving that, sitting up in my glass and steel tower of One Raffles Quay or Capital Square. So yeah, those were just some of my own, look, I'm speaking from the heart and just sharing my own story, clearly not trying to say that anyone necessarily needs to make a move into Agri-Food Tech or any other venture space for that matter. But I think for me, it was also a desire to perhaps be looking at an industry which required a lot of transformation. And again, we've seen a lot of investment dollar going into fintech as a natural evolution from the finance industry. If I wanted to get involved in venture or startups, fintech would have been a natural sort of evolution for me coming from the banking space. But I think for me, it was, a belief that perhaps it was, already oversaturated and you didn't need another ex-banker sort of going to work in the fintech space. I felt like I could perhaps lend my voice and my resources to something which I felt was perhaps more impactful, if I can use that term here. And part of that, I think part of this journey for me was just having a young family and having my kids starting to grow up and becoming little, mini humans and mini consumers in their own right, and challenging me as a father, wanting to learn about, what we're buying, what we're eating every day. I think for me and my wife, food was always a real joy for us to share from our early days in college. And she comes from a culinary and F&B background, and I just like to eat food. So food was always a big sort of part of our life, and we sort of brought that into our home as we raised the family. And whether we were traveling back to Hawaii to visit my parents or going to New York to see her family, we would always be going to farms and picking vegetables or interacting with the animals and just showing the kids, teaching them about our food system, and having them help out in the kitchen and learning about preparation and all of this. And having spent the last 13 years of my life in Singapore, it slowly dawned upon me that despite being such a crazy, passionate food society as we are here, there's somewhat of a disconnect. I think certainly that was my perception, and hopefully many of you would agree. There's a disconnect between the 90% of food imports that we rely upon and the general, I guess, knowledge and awareness of where our food comes from. And I think ever since becoming a Singaporean back in 2016, these questions of national importance and sort of topical debate, I guess let's just say I became increasingly attuned or aware of them. Singapore's vulnerability to climate change, obviously, and as well as Singapore's vulnerability to food imports. And obviously there's a strong overlap there. So these were some of the, I guess, motivating factors or subliminal sort of thoughts that I was, I guess, thinking about along my journey and during my time at the bank, which ultimately, led me to believe that I could, or feel convicted and confident enough about, making that jump and, focusing my efforts on this space. So, yeah, look, I think the food passion, the disconnect was definitely a large motivating factor for me. So in 2019, just earlier last year, I resigned from Morgan Stanley, full of conviction that I would leap into this wonderful nascent space of Agri-Food Tech. And it just so happened that my last week at Morgan Stanley, March 8th, 2019, the government of Singapore decided to announce its 30 by 30 agenda. And so here it was, I guess, validating my belief that this is a serious problem and requires a lot of energy and attention. So I think it's fair to say I felt pretty good about the decision and that I was kind of on the right path. And so for the early few months of last year, I essentially went about navigating the space, meeting the players. It's fair to say that it was relatively small back then, as it still is today. But so I wasn't necessarily sort of at a loss of who to speak to. It was what I found. What I found to my pleasant discovery was everyone's pretty open to sharing. It's just a small, friendly community because everyone's working for the same mission and working towards the same goal of solving these problems. So in early 2019, I set up Makana Ventures as a Singapore-based collective, if you will, essentially a platform for awareness and engagement to discuss some of these pressing issues in our food system. In reality, it basically just gave me an excuse to have a name besides my Gmail address on a business card. So Makana Ventures was born. And along the way, I started making a few angel investments in some of these companies which I had been following, including Shock Meats, A Billion Veg, a company out of the US, GrowFlux, who are operating in different aspects of the sort of food system, if you will, but essentially, I guess, had to do with trying to transform their particular vertical in a more sort of sustainable vision and deliver either a better product or a stronger message to society and around Southeast Asia. So in addition to the investments, obviously there were a lot of fun dinner parties and some of these roundtable discussions, which I would put together and host through the year. But look, it was tough work, as a sort of single founder. I can't really call myself a founder at that point, but going at it by myself, despite a lot of friends kind of joining me on the ride, be it through the investment channel or participating in the events. But long story short, this brought me into conversation with Michael Dean, remember, one of the founding partners of AgFunder, and for a period of let's say 12 months from 2018 until the time when we started talking more seriously, Michael had been, I guess, speaking to the Singaporean government about the possibility of AgFunder setting up a base of operations here. Obviously hoping to expand its footprint out of Silicon Valley and the West Coast, and enter a new geography, with Asia clearly being the biggest opportunity, I guess, to make a difference and get involved in. So by the middle of 2019, I guess Enterprise Singapore and our friends at EDB had convinced Michael that Singapore would be a good place for AgFunder to set up a base of operations here in Asia. and hence AgFunder Asia was born. And that's when I got involved as the director of AgFunder Asia. And part of our activities would be, in addition to hiring a local reporter. So Jack's face was on the slide. Actually, you saw the slide of the team earlier. So we've got a local reporter, Jack Ellis, on the ground here, creating a lot of sort of content and fresh news around, the exciting startups and deal activity that's taking place here in Southeast Asia. We have obviously the fund, which I'll talk about later. And then the third and perhaps most exciting pillar, which was new to AgFunder, was the launch of a dedicated Agri-Food Tech Accelerator. We're proud to say the first in Southeast Asia focused on the Agri-Food Tech space. And so that's called Grow now. I think we're going to come to Grow in a little bit, but essentially, so AgFunder Asia has those three key pillars: acceleration as a sort of ecosystem catalyst, investment into the industry, as we talked about, early stage investment being one of the most important factors to drive transformation. And then finally, creating content and lending our voice. Allow me, I guess, to talk a little bit about the Asia investment thesis in the last few minutes. I don't need to tell anyone on the call, I guess, the sort of macro statistics or the opportunities that sort of Asia provides for anyone looking to do business here. Obviously, in the context of food and ag, it's obvious where Asia is already home to two of the world's most populous countries. And over the next 10 years, we're expecting another 250 million in this region, so that by 2030, Asia will be home to more than half the world's population. This enormous number of human beings represents 60% of global consumption. China alone accounts for a third of the world's meat demand. So clearly, the importance of focusing on Asia and the activities which AgFunder could be doing here to invest in and help to transform the Asian food system is obvious. I think in terms of commercial opportunity, one of the statistics is the price tag that we can apply to food spending in our region is $4 trillion a year, which is expected to double by the time we get to 2030. But obviously, with big opportunities comes big challenges, and this sort of starts to shift the narrative towards, I guess, the impact focus of our activities here at AgFunder. This chart represents the results of a survey done by PwC last year when asking its audience about, what is the biggest challenge to Asia's agri-food sector. So as we can see here, a clear, obvious answer, the concerns around climate change and environmental degradation. And you might think that there are other aspects of farming, whether it's sort of smallholder accessibility to capital, or any of these other concerns which might rise to the top of the table. But my personal interpretation of this result is clearly inspired by the fact that we have such a strong and increasing urban population here, and climate change is very real to us all living along the equator. I mean, just in the last 13 years that I've been in Singapore, I think the average temperature increase has been at least 3 or 4 degrees Celsius. The fact is, 17 of the largest 25 cities in the world will be found in Asia by the year 2030. And yet, when you consider that only 1/4 of Asia's landmass is arable, so questions that Singapore is facing today in terms of our 90% reliance on food import is clearly going to be felt in many more cities and population densities around the region as over the next decades to come. And so I think that perhaps brings me to the aspect of investing in impact, and again, sort of reflective of my own motivation to move into this space. I don't want to badmouth the good work that a lot of my ex-colleagues would be doing in the financial industry, but I think just from a personal perspective, my day-to-day focus on sort of macro products, fixed income, and currencies, and public markets only went so far in matching the sort of values that I felt that I wanted to be spending my time on, or perhaps opportunities, both in terms of the investment space as well as the critical challenges that we as a society face. Focusing my energy in that direction versus a topic and industry such as agri-food. So, yeah, look, I think the reality, as some of you will be very aware of these statistics in terms of the Asia landscape and the opportunity to get involved here, both from the sort of the commercial growth in population and demand and consumption, the rising middle class, obviously what that means, both in terms of a demand profile for novel foods, and we've talked about sort of alternative proteins before, but even very simply protein full stop, right? I mentioned the statistic about China's ravenous consumption for meat. I'm going to go out on a limb here and question, who are we to say that, the sort of rising middle class in China can only eat plant-based meats? Clearly they have a natural, just a cultural hunger for real animal meat. And so, we need to think of, novel ways of producing that and delivering it to the consumer in a more sustainable manner than is currently being employed today through, traditional animal husbandry. On top of that, obviously we have serious issues with food waste here, not just in Asia, but globally, when you consider that approximately a third of the world's produce is wasted or lost every year. Staggering statistics, and when you break it down between geographies, whether it's pre-consumer sort of food waste or post-consumer food loss, this is a massive challenge which we need to address. And I recognize, sorry, we are actually running out of time. I've been blabbering on a little bit. Perhaps I might wrap up and leave some of these questions on impact to the Q&A, and obviously I can sort of touch upon it more in terms of what we're trying to do here. But I'll sort of wrap up the presentation by saying that in my view, there is such a strong alignment in terms of the sector that we're operating in agri-food, as well as the question, the identified sustainable development goals, if you want to think about impact and sustainability in those relatively simplistic terms. But here I've just listed a number of the SDGs, which can easily be mapped, and which we are mapping onto our portfolio construction and our investment selection at AgFunder. And I can only apologize for not getting onto the juicy bits about some of our activities here, the fund or the Singapore Food Bowl program, but perhaps we can explore more of that during the Q&A or at a later stage. So I'm just going to fast forward to my thank you slide. There you go. Thank you very much. There's my email address. I'm sure Sophia will be sharing that as well. And let's open it up to the questions for the few remaining minutes we've got left.
Thanks, John. That was very insightful. Fantastic. So I do have some questions as well. So before that, let's take this question from Nelson. So Nelson asked, do you think snack tech is related to AgFunder Tech? We're building world's snack ecosystem for B2C and B2B.
Snack tech. I mean, absolutely. It would be part of the landscape which we're looking at, be it from an investment or for an analysis lens. It falls within that sort of novel food area. Now I need to sort of be careful in how I answer this. I'm not sure, Nelson, what your background is, or perhaps you're an entrepreneur in the snack tech space. I think what's most interesting about the sort of the snacking food sector, well, obviously the market size is humongous. The commercial opportunity there is massive, and if you can incorporate some of these more, if I can use the term, meaningful or value delivering solutions to your snack product in terms of ingredients and nutrition, biofortification of the sort of ingredients or the crops that you use to put into your snacks, then you've got a strong future. Unfortunately, if you're just trying to create a new chocolate bar or something like that, then good luck to you.
Okay, so John, you shared about the findings by PwC earlier. We know that there are the challenges set in Asia as well. So part of it is the diversity, complexity, and also they talk about a little bit about regulations. So do you want to expand on that?
Let's see, diversity, for example. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So if we think about the sort of the origin story of AgFunder starting up in the US and focusing largely on the North American landscape, it's clear that how AgFunder has operated and the types of investments, types of companies which we've chosen to invest in over the past 7 years is not the sort of companies or technologies that are applicable to the Asian landscape. The way of doing business, the way of producing food here and distributing it, and the cultural consumer demands are totally different from one market to the next. And I think that's been it's been an obvious reality which we knew about when expanding into Asia, but it's going to require a lot more sort of, I guess, education in terms of speaking to potential investors, because a lot of the research and a lot of the I guess existing investment has largely focused on developed market, and the innovation has largely focused on developed market. Take, for example, farm robotics and drones and precision agriculture technology, which just wouldn't fit a smallholder farmer, the budget, the land size, etc. So, the way that we're looking at investments here for the Grow Sustainability Fund, which I unfortunately didn't get a lot of time to talk about, but we'll be investing with a sort of Asia-focused lens on companies and technologies with a more sort of sustainability impact focus here in Asia. And obviously these types of technologies and solutions that the companies are going to be delivering to the market are vastly different from what we've been investing in the North American market. So I'm really excited about this and the ability to obviously sort of innovate our own innovation lens to a new context.
Great, we are equally as excited. Audience, please keep your questions coming through. So next question from Honda. Thanks for the great presentation, John. You'll talk about the whole big area of food tech, food retail tech, and agri-tech. Could you talk more about agri-tech in Southeast Asia?
Right, so a natural sort of follow on from my last point. The needs and challenges of ag tech in Southeast Asia again are vastly different from the technologies and innovations that we've seen emerging in North America. The main focus that we see it, or certainly when you consider the countries where the bulk of agriculture is coming from, Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, the types of producers that we're dealing with, the smallholder farmers who are operating on anywhere from 1 to 5 acres of plot size compared to 500 to 1,000 acres in the US at a sort of minimum. Obviously the types of technologies which are going to be meaningful and transformative for the smallholders are vastly different from other places in the world. Supply chain innovation is an area which we have seen increasing amount of interest in, obviously sort of post the COVID experience, as I mentioned, but I would also just make reference to the latest Accelerator program, which we've just launched, called the Singapore Food Bowl, obviously inspired by the nation's 30 by 30 agenda in terms of what we're trying to achieve here for Singapore, and how can we apply technologies which are going to accelerate our productivity and our ability to realize this very ambitious target. You know, amongst the 80 odd applications that we received, and, you know, applications closed a couple of weeks ago, we've just finished our selection process, and I look forward to announcing the final cohort very soon. But, you know, amongst the 80 odd applications we received from around the region, there was obviously a strong focus on urban farming, naturally, for, you know, the Singapore context. But the second highest category that we received applications for was digital supply chain, which grows, you know, which reflects an increasing awareness and demand for improved logistics services, you know, decreasing food waste, whether it's a cold storage solution. And we've seen some really novel and creative, low cost solutions for, you know, basic cold storage distribution, to, you know, traceability and leveraging blockchain technology to add that sort of visibility and traceability across the supply chain and to deliver that to the consumer. Really exciting sectors which are emerging as sort of very sort of valuable investment areas here in Asia.
Right. So I'll come back to the other questions. We mentioned about the 30-30 goal. So let's continue that. Where is Singapore now relative to our 30 by 30 aims? What leap is required to get there, and what is lacking? Technology, government support, or funding? This is from Suhaimi.
Thank you, Suhaimi. Again, I imagine that, you know, some of our friends in the various agencies are listening this morning. So all I can say is, look, thank you for the continued support. But obviously, I think everyone would admit that a lot more needs to be done. There was a report published last year by Temasek, I want to say, sorry, apologies if I get this wrong, but Temasek, PwC, and Rabobank, the sort of Asia Food Challenge, which listed a $800 billion investment requirement to meet the rising demands of the Asia population by the year 2030. You know, when you consider that, you know, Agri-Food Tech received 20 billion last year in investment, it's an enormous amount, and clearly one which, you know, the established industry players, be it, you know, big food, and, you know, government cannot achieve by themselves. So we really need this concerted collaborative effort, increasing amount of private capital, private investment, private innovators, private side innovators, sorry, I'm talking about, to work together with government, to work together with big agri and big food to deliver these solutions and bring the money in and apply it to the farms, and, you know, bring the talent and the knowledge. You know, it's exciting. It's early days here in Singapore. Obviously, we don't have a rich agricultural history like many of our regional neighbors, but, you know, if we open our doors and our eyes and work together, we can learn so much from them, and use Singapore as a sort of launch pad or a hub for, you know, recognizing the value add that we can create here in terms of IP development, R&D, know-how, borrow from established industries such as biotech and, you know, manufacturing 4.0, which Singapore has been pouring a lot of money and investment into over the last several decades. Translate that into the sort of agri-food tech space, which I'm happy to say Singapore and the government is already doing. So yeah, thank you for the fantastic work, and long may it continue, because clearly this is a big challenge and opportunity which requires that sort of coordinated effort from across public and private. So yes, Suhaimi, you know, hope you can join us in our mission.
Great. So we'll try to address all the questions here. Thank you. So next from Paul, of course, climate change is one of the factors that we need Agri-Food Tech to be invented. So while climate comes up in the survey as pressingly important, does this translate to investment returns or just a good intention?
So the way that AgFunder looks at, you know, climate change and sustainability is obviously through an agri-food tech lens. So, you know, I can sort of speak to our investments in this particular sector, and, you know, the sort of performance that we're seeing based on our sort of early portfolio tracking. Fortunately, we've been investing in this space for the last 7 years. What started off as a relatively small sort of founders pool of capital, family and friends, now into a more traditional VC structure with limited partners, etc. Yeah, look, I'm happy to report that it's not simply a philanthropic, mission-driven, nice to do investment thesis. There are positive returns that we are seeing in this space, which match any other type of venture capital industry in terms of the sort of typical IRRs that are being generated from our early stage portfolios. We're talking about 25-30% annual IRR from valuation uplift in tracking these companies that we're investing in. I think, look, I need to put that into context. We're an early stage investor. We typically invest in sort of seed to Series A companies. So even if these were some of our earliest investments in the portfolio, they've at this point they're only sort of 5-6 years maturity wise, but based on that sort of valuation uplift and growth, these are the sort of numbers that we're able to see, that we're sort of generating in terms of the investment opportunity. I think yeah, sorry, I'll wrap it up with that.
Right, so probably 2 more questions. Singsal Corporate, do you see AgTech industry being democratized in the future, or do you think global giants like Bunge, if I pronounce it correctly, Monsanto, etc., will consolidate all innovation through acquiring AgTech businesses before they become real competitors?
The big ABCs, right? Archer Daniel Midland, Bunge, and Cargill, and the likes of Wilmar and Olam here. Look, it's a reality. There are giants in the agribusiness space who have grown as the industry has evolved and consolidated. And I don't want to say that these existing players are necessarily the reason why we're in the sort of situation that we're at today. Look, there's a lot of real benefit and advantages in terms of the efficiencies that have been sort of born or evolved out of this sort of mass agri evolution over the last sort of 50 to 100 years. But clearly, I think in the context of climate change and the way that we're farming and recognizing the need to sort of think more innovatively, something has to change in terms of production and distribution, all the elements which we've talked about on this presentation. Look, I think it's really positive when you see the likes of pretty much all of these big players working with startups in some way, shape, or form, whether it's through in-house sort of innovation platforms or corporate venture capital arms. Tyson, one of the biggest meat producers in the US, was one of the early backers of Beyond Meats, and obviously they reaped the rewards from a commercial perspective, but also from learning from these startups, learning how they bring new product to market, so that today Tyson and Nestle and even Cargill are launching their own plant-based products on the market. Excuse me for a second. So yeah, I think we're seeing that sort of mindset shift from big ag and big food, recognizing that from a disruption narrative, these lean, mean startups are metaphorically and literally have the ability to eat their lunch. Whether it's Impossible or Beyond, or local guys like Karana or Future Foods in the plant-based space, OmniPork, etc. These are companies which are only a couple of years old. Obviously, Beyond and Impossible have a head start, but they're increasingly taking market share away from the incumbents. And so, how do the incumbents adapt and either invest or partner and innovate? And that's one of the roles that we're playing as well through the Grow Accelerator program, which again I didn't get to say much about, but I'll give a quick shout out to the team at Grow and some of the activities that we're doing. Part of the Singapore Food Bowl, which we're about to launch, is working with big corporates to identify and partner lean startups who are developing technologies to transform the food system. We're proud to have on board with us Dole Packaged Foods as our lead corporate sponsor, who are sponsoring 2 startups through the program, and that they will work very closely with these relatively early stage companies in the identified areas of packaged food and food waste. So Dole can learn from them. Dole can incorporate these sort of best practices and innovation into their own business line. So really exciting sort of collaboration opportunities emerging in this space.
Great, thanks, John. I'm afraid we have to wrap up now. So I know that a couple of questions, you can take this offline. So yeah, your email address is included in the slides. So slides are available upon request. So thank you again, John. Thank you again, participants, for joining us today. So if you want to reach out to John, there's an email address there, and also he's on LinkedIn. So, so fill up the survey once you exit from this webinar. I'd like to see everyone again on the 7th of July. That's on our next webinar on future cities, work and life after COVID-19 at 6 p.m. So stay safe, stay well, and see you on 7th of July. Thanks again, John. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Sophia. And I hope everyone took something positive away from this conversation, food for thought, at least. And there's a role that everyone can play in transforming our food system. So please, if you'd like more information or to just reach out, you have my contact information. Thanks again, Sophia and Spectrum, for hosting us this morning.
Thank you, John. Thank you, AgFunder. Bye-bye.